Good evening, everyone. My name is Virginia Cady, and I'm a student project manager at the Clark Forum for Contemporary Issues at Dickinson College. On behalf of the Clark Forum, Dickinson College, the House Divided Project, the Digital Humanities Advisory Committee, I would like to welcome you to tonight's event, Mary Lincoln's Assassination. Introducing tonight's speaker is Matt Pinsker, Associate Professor of History and Pohanka Chair in American Civil War History at Dickinson College. His research interests include the Underground Railroad, Abraham Lincoln, American constitutionalism, and historical U.S. campaigns, elections, and partisanship. Pinsker is also the director of the House Divided Project. At this time, I would like to ask that you please silence all cell phones or other electronic devices. A question and answer session will follow the lecture, so please hold all questions until then. And now, please join me in welcoming Professor Pinsker.
Well, thank you all so much for coming. We're marking the end of the Civil War anniversary. It's been 150 years since the American Civil War, and tomorrow marks the 150th anniversary of Lincoln's assassination. It's an important week to reflect on historical developments, and that's why Catherine Clinton is here. I'll introduce her in a minute, but I just wanted to sketch out for you just briefly what we've been doing here at Dickinson during this anniversary. The House Divided Project was kind of launched at the beginning of the 150th anniversary. That was 4 years ago in April 2011. That was a project that Professor John Osborne and I helped start here with the help of a lot of people. And it's been an amazing experience. We've created a dozen or more different websites that have, in this 4-year period, about 4 million page views. And a number of educational videos done by students at this school that have over 400,000 views on YouTube. We have 50,000 records in this online database that we've created, a Civil War research engine during these 4 years, and about 14,000 images for public use in classrooms from the period. We've trained about 5,000 K-12 educators from across the country, either here on campus or online. We've got about 50 undergraduates who participated as interns on this project. Some of them are now actually employed and getting paid in the real world, and they're here. So I want to thank them for all their hard work. We've had a group of scholarly advisors who've been extraordinary, 6 in particular, who are leading scholars in the field, people like David Blight and Eric Foner and Jim Oakes and Catherine Clinton. And 4 of these 6 have now come here to speak. David Blight launched us in April of 2011, and now Catherine Clinton is here to help us end the commemoration of this anniversary. She's the right person to do that because she's a noted biographer. Catherine Clinton is a biographer of Fanny Kemble and Harriet Tubman and Mary Lincoln. She's the Denman Professor of American History at the University of Texas at San Antonio. She's a kind of legend in the field of 19th century U.S. social history. I've known her for years, and she's been a real supporter of the work we've done here. And I'm very excited to hear what she's going to tell us today, because this week, as we think about Lincoln's assassination, the tragedy of that week, sometimes Mary Lincoln can get lost in that story. The wife of this man who was with him from beginning to end. There's no other person in his life who spanned his career the way she did. And yet, she sometimes gets lost in the commemorations of what happened to him. And Catherine is going to help us restore her place and explain it to us in a way that I think will illuminate and elucidate the story powerfully. She's going to talk about what happened that week. She's going to talk about Mary Lincoln's life as a widow. And then what she's going to do is talk about the role that historians have played in debating her reputation and legacy in recent years. Afterwards, there'll be time for Q&A, and then also Catherine is going to be available to sign her books out in the hallway. Jim Schmick from Civil War and More is here. We have a number of people here from the community, the Civil War community, the school district community, and so I want to thank everybody for participating in this. And I know I have a number of my students here, and I just want to tell you thank you for coming. You're going to get credit for this. But also, make sure you ask questions. Catherine is good at question and answer, and I want to take full advantage of that. So without further ado, Catherine Clinton.
Thank you. Well, I'm so pleased to have such a diverse and quite a welcoming audience. I have been on your campus before. I have done research here before, but I'm seeing people from all different walks. Archivist Dick Summers, who helped me when I first came here, and I got to meet some of the students, and I see maybe potential students here as well. So it really is, I hope, an audience here to gather and commemorate, because it is the sesquicentennial year of Abraham Lincoln's death, and Americans are naturally focused on honoring the memory of this fallen leader. His legacy remains daunting, particularly for American historians called to fuel the insatiable hunger for new books on Lincoln. But at this moment in Lincoln's legacy, it might behoove us to look at the impact of Lincoln's death on another key player in the Civil War White House, Mary Lincoln. And it's my hope, from the vantage point of a century and a half, we can find a more authentic narrative to appreciate what I have come to call Mary Lincoln's assassination. I'm not trying to seek equality, parity, or any other false construct for Mrs. Lincoln as an historical figure, but I do think a more judicious appreciation of her role in Lincoln's life and legacy would be served by examining a 3D approach. The 3 dimensions I recommend are the experience of Mary Lincoln on the night of April 14th and subsequent trauma, the scrutiny and vitriol endured by Lincoln's wife, particularly while in the White House, and then trying to carve out a place for herself as first widow. And third, the character assassination heaped on Mary most blatantly by a parade of Lincoln scholars, and I'm hoping to weave these 3 into a better dimensional portrait of her life and legacy. Now, the full dimensions of Lincoln's assassination and death are well chronicled. There are over 600 titles available on that topic in the Library of Congress. But Mary's side of the story, the full impact of this tragedy, remains relatively underexplored and might continue to be. For example, I'm on the board at Ford's Theater, and when it was proposed that a play be commissioned called The Widow Lincoln in order to look at her life, there were 2 very vocal objections by members of the board. Why were we even looking at Mary? But I would suggest that her influence over Lincoln's legacy, most particularly his association with black rights as the martyr president, gunned down by an opponent of either the black vote or someone trying to gun down the great emancipator, is something we need to think about. On April 11th, 1865, just 2 days after Lee surrendered to Grant, Lincoln addressed a crowd that had gathered at the White House. Lincoln knew reconciliation between former enemies would be challenging, but he discussed the need for cooperation and mentioned the possibility of black veterans voting. He ended his speech by suggesting there would be further developments. As historian Vernon Burton has suggested, one man in the audience understood perfectly what Lincoln intimated. John Wilkes Booth told his companion it meant black citizenship, and he confided, "Now, by God, I'll put him through. That's the last speech he will ever make." Historians continue to debate the myriad reasons why Lincoln was killed, but recent scholarship has confirmed that Lincoln's assassination was, at a minimum, politically motivated, at a maximum, a hate crime that elevated him to our first major civil rights martyr. As Burton reminds us, Lincoln is part of a long list of martyrs who died for black voting rights: Medgar Evers, Viola Liuzzo, James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, Michael Schwerner, Martin Luther King Jr., and tragically, many more so. Booth's misguided attempt to rouse the defeated South to carry on the Revolutionary Rebellion when his murder of the president on Good Friday took on religious dimensions that mourners across the world, from Black Easter forward, linked his death to that of a savior's passing. To Mary Lincoln, it was a terrible fulfillment of a premonition which had haunted her for years. It was the event that divided her life into before and after, a wound which would not heal. How did she experience the death of her husband, something which 500,000 wives had suffered in the past half-decade? Not well, indeed extremely poorly. It was this initial period of grief that signaled what she would have to endure, the loss of her protector, as well as any comfort or joy. Lincoln and his wife arrived late at Ford's Theater on the night of Friday, April 14, 1865. Their entrance interrupted the action on stage as the band struck up, "Hail to the Chief," and the Lincolns, as well as their guests, Clara Harris, the daughter of a senator, and her fiancé, Major Henry Rathbone, settled into seats in the presidential box. Celebrated actress Laura Keene was playing a starring role in Our American Cousin. The play was popular, but Lincoln's presence turned the evening into a really exuberant patriotic occasion. We know Lincoln was a devoted theater goer. He had attended more than 100 nights of plays during his presidency. But with peace declared, this evening promised to be jubilant. Mrs. Lincoln was particularly relieved because her son Robert had returned home from duty. She and her husband had fought bitterly over his enlistment, but harmony was restored with his safe return. Lincoln had written his wife a playful note to invite her on a carriage drive earlier in the day, a gesture which harked back to their youth. Their talk in the carriage outing was full of cheer, a quality that had too often eluded them during the previous 4 years. The president's courtly attentiveness and the young engaged couple who accompanied them to the theater enhanced Mrs. Lincoln's romantic mood. While watching the play, she'd been clinging to her husband's arm and teased him about what their guests might think of her, to which Lincoln replied, "She won't think anything about it." These were his last words. Close to 10 p.m., John Wilkes Booth crept into the presidential box and fired his pistol directly into the back of Lincoln's head. Next, he attacked Henry Rathbone with a knife before leaping on stage, shouting, "Sic semper tyrannis," thus always to tyrants, the Virginia state motto. Whether Booth hurt his leg falling from the box or escaping on horseback remains a matter of dispute, as do so many of the events that evening, dissolving into chaos, noise, blood. Everything went out of focus for Mary except her husband's head slumped forward on his chest, his limbs slack in the rocker. Witnesses all agree that Mrs. Lincoln's screams alerted the audience. Once she saw blood, she shrieked, "They have shot the president." Watching a doctor, unable to find her husband's pulse, attempting mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, followed by Lincoln's revived breathing, proved traumatizing, particularly for Mary. She felt helpless as the soldiers lifted her husband onto a litter and carried him across the street into the house owned by William Peterson. During the ghastly scenes which unfolded, Mary wondered aloud why it was not she who was shot. But Lincoln alone was wounded, and doctors agreed there was no expectation of recovery. But as attendants warmed his limbs, changed his dressings, all except Mary recognized that the end was near. The cabinet gathered by Lincoln's bedside, while Secretary of War Stanton issued orders, took charge, updating the outside world, trying to organize an unprecedented national manhunt to apprehend the assassin. The National Park Service preservation of the Peterson home allows visitors today to reimagine Lincoln's last hours as they enter the cramped bedroom at the rear of the house. Although many portraits include Mrs. Lincoln kneeling or sitting by the bed during Lincoln's final moments, the truth was that she had been banished from the room. Mary wanted to remain by her husband's side, but when she began to sob hysterically, she was taken to a nearby parlor. Near dawn, Mrs. Lincoln realized that her husband was not getting better, but worse. She collapsed onto the floor in a faint. Edwin Stanton barked, "Take that woman out and do not let her in again." The deathbed of a loved one involved the most hallowed of 19th century rituals. Mary's ancestors were Scots-Irish women who might keen for hours, if not days, over the body of a departing loved one. In Victorian America, attending a dying husband was a wife's most sacred duty and obligation. To press into her memory his final moments, to be there at the very end. Everyone in the crowded room that night knew a wife's privilege. When Lincoln's breathing became halting and labored around 7 a.m., no one summoned Mary. Instead, Reverend Phineas Gurley suggested prayer as more than a dozen men encircled their beloved leader and bowed their head. At 7:22 a.m., Abraham Lincoln, the 16th President of the United States, was pronounced dead. Edwin Stanton uttered his famous tribute. Now he belongs to the ages. But forgotten are the words of Mary Lincoln, the wife kept from her husband's bedside. When informed of the president's passing, she cried out, "Oh, why did you not tell me he was dying?" Her crying could be heard throughout the house, and her wails of grief alerted those outside. Abraham Lincoln was gone. And it was in that moment, the circle of men surrounding Lincoln, expelling his wife from his dying bedside, that Mary's betrayal began. She became an exile within her own historical experience. With her husband's death, Mary was cast adrift, only able to imagine assuming a rightful place alongside her husband in death. Mary did not want to leave her husband. She stayed on at the Peterson house another 2 hours after Lincoln was pronounced dead, until Robert persuaded her to take a carriage back to the White House, where Tad was waiting. Mary was only able to rouse herself as a mother, having been so cruelly cheated as a wife. While Abraham Lincoln's reputation soared and has only grown more revered over the years, perhaps immortal in the American historical imagination, his wife's reputation tumbled into deeper decline following her husband's death, as she has been condemned all too often as infernal. She became an object of pity, consigned to the sidebars of her husband's narrative text. Mary Lincoln did survive to attend one of her son's weddings, to see grandchildren born, to visit European capitals of which she and her husband both dreamed, to establish rhythm and patterns as war widows were forced to do. She dedicated herself to keeping Lincoln's legend burnished, his halo polished, but simultaneously, Mrs. Lincoln endured a series of crippling humiliations and losses during widowhood, attacks magnified by her vulnerability, her personality. Contemporaries and scholars alike debate the relationship between Lincoln and his wife. Perhaps no other occupants of the White House have endured such media attention until the Kennedy White House of the 1960s and the media industrial complex that surrounds the White House ever after. But even this has been suppressed by the storms of speculation that frequently engulf the 42nd president, William Jefferson Clinton, and his wife Hillary, as a new book on the White House this spring highlights. And when kindly, again, as a board member, I have the privilege of talking with Matt often about his projects, and we were having an interview interrupted by a reporter from the Washington Post who wanted to know about Mary Lincoln's domestic abuse of her husband. Was it similar to Hillary Clinton's? And so, we find that, I guess, the Clark Contemporary Forum is very contemporary with having me here today. But her relationship with her husband continued to fascinate and indeed perplex. Even in the immediate wake of Abraham Lincoln's death, did he love Mary first? Did he love her best? Did he love her at all? Was she the only woman who could cajole him from his crippling and frequent bouts of melancholy and redirect him toward his destined greatness, in which she firmly believed? Did she nag and abuse him and give him no peace? Was she a partner only for proprietary sake, a requisite vessel to produce the children he so cherished? Was Lincoln's desire for male companionship purely spiritual, or was there a physical component? Claims, contradictions, counterclaims continue to shake, rattle, and roll Lincoln scholars. If we examine the facts of the Lincoln courtship, naturally disputes erupt. Who was more invested in the marriage during courtship? Did Mary flirt with one too many rivals and force Abraham to call it off? Did his attraction to Matilda Edwards cause Lincoln to get cold feet concerning his attachment to Mary Todd? Did reminders of a previous proposal to Mary Owens delay the nuptials? Did the disapproval of Mary's relatives become an obstacle to their relationship? Was there a wedding planned in January 1841? And if so, who called it off? Was there breaking off relations, the event referred to in Lincoln's correspondence as the fatal first? Was his disappointment in love the source of his deep depression in the winter of 1841? Historians paint vividly differing portraits of this period in Lincoln's life and dramatically different interpretations of the Lincolns. But once The gold ring was slipped on Mary's finger during the ceremony in November of 1842. The two entwined their fates, perhaps allowing the pulsing currents stirring within each of them to flow together. Mary was her husband's sounding board for every speech. She was deeply partisan, blindly loyal, and held fierce grudges. Advice flowed freely as they read the papers, aloud to one another on a daily basis. She believed she'd married a diamond in the rough, and she spent a good deal of her time polishing and promoting him. In 1858, Lincoln confided to journalist Henry Villard that his wife insisted that he would eventually be president of the United States. Even Mary's critics give her credit for playing a crucial role in the rise of Lincoln in the 1850s. Her scheming helped Lincoln attain his nomination as Republican presidential candidate. They were both very jubilant at his election. When New England aristocrat Edward Everett spoke at a little town down the road, I'm trying to remember, it was in November 1863. But anyway, at this particular talk, he got to meet President Lincoln, and Mary would have loved Everett's estimation that the polish Abraham Lincoln had acquired, quote, may be credited to the influence of his wife. Yet her husband's election put Mary under the microscope as press coverage became relentless in the winter of 1860-61. One reporter described the entire female population are in ecstasies of curiosity to know who she was, what she is, what she looks like, what her manner is, and if she has a presence of the sort necessary in the exalted station to which she will soon be introduced. But those who wish to set a house on fire may start with the thatch. So the First Lady became a very easy target for the press. She felt herself in a fishbowl. As one journalist recalled, if she but drives down Pennsylvania Avenue, the electric wire trills the news to every hamlet in the Union. When the Lincolns arrived at the White House, Harriet Lane, President James Buchanan's niece, wrote cattily, Mrs. Lincoln is awfully Western, loud, unrefined. At one of Mrs. Lincoln's first receptions in March 1861, British journalist William Howard Russell found the attendance was very scanty. The Washington ladies have not yet made up their minds that Mrs. Lincoln is the fashion. They miss their Southern friends, and they draw constant comparison between them and the vulgar Yankee women who are now in power. Some of the earliest press reports portrayed Mary as incapable of measuring up to the refined Eastern standards. Mrs. Lincoln was offended by these cold shoulders, and she wanted to prove her critics wrong. The new First Lady believed the White House should be a shining symbol of a great nation, especially when peril abounded. Yet the executive mansion was shabby, with furniture left over from the Madison era. Springfield relations said the place resembled a second-rate hotel, with threadbare carpets and chopped-up drapes. Mary sought the advice of the Commissioner of Buildings for the district, a William S. Wood. Now, Wood was a former hotel manager and tour organizer who'd been drafted by New York party boss Thurlow Weed to assist the Lincolns. His combination of shameless flattery and smooth manner ingratiated him to Mrs. Lincoln, and she championed him in the spring of 1861. Instead of safeguarding Mrs. Lincoln during an excursion to Manhattan, Wood wheedled for a permanent appointment. He was pocketing kickbacks. In May 1861, one particularly outraged New York reporter said in disdain, "She's expending thousands and thousands of dollars for articles of luxurious taste." Kinswoman Lizzie Grimsley, who had accompanied on this trip to Manhattan, was adamant in her cousin's defense. Mary did not indulge in 1/100th part of the extravagance with which she and I were credited. Mary did select a very fine Haviland dinner service in Solferino with gilt decor for state occasions. Solferino is a color that's gone out of fashion. It was named after a battle. The Battle of Magenta, I think, is perhaps better known today. But she designated the seal of the United States on each piece. Presidential china was nothing new. This very same pattern, as a matter of fact, was selected by First Lady Michelle Obama for the inaugural luncheon for her husband in January 2009. What is remembered is neither Mrs. Lincoln's taste nor her patriotism, but that she ordered a second set at a cost of $1,100, emblazoned with her own initials. Grimsley insisted that it was not paid for by the district commissioner, as was most unkindly charged. And we can dig out the Riggs Bank receipt, which shows that Lincoln did pay for this himself. But Secretary of the Treasury Simon Chase fueled rumors about Mary's extravagance, about financial irregularities. He regaled his daughter Kate with tales of Mrs. Lincoln's overspending, scandalous reports about Mrs. Lincoln and Lincoln himself emanated from the Treasury Department and, quote, its special agents. Newspapers full of allegations fueled the controversy, and gossip had a field day. While a New York reporter accompanied the First Lady wardrobe shopping, she told him she could not afford luxury goods in cashmere and lace with which the merchants were tempting her. She was determined to be economical. We do have evidence, however, that the First Lady may have compromised this pledge. We know she also compromised ethics to which her husband subscribed, particularly frugality. However, scholars are still debating whether any criminal activity was involved. Wood was investigated for bad financial practices and removed from office. Naturally, critics painted Wood's relationship with the First Lady as darkly as possible, intimating that their connection had been illicit and sexual, a rumor which was vindictive and maintained lethal longevity. One journalist confided, "The ladies in Washington delight to hear or to invent scandals connected with the White House." Critics would continue to spread stories. The New York Herald editor complained in October about the abuse heaped on Mary Lincoln, but she remained at the center of media controversy and bad press. Even her husband's own staff referred to their boss's wife as Hellcat. She suffered severe mood swings after, first, the death of her beloved son Willie in February 1862, and then following a head injury from a carriage accident in June 1863. The following year, in late April 1864, she went on another shopping spree in Manhattan. The papers took aim. Mrs. Lincoln ransacked the treasures of Broadway dry goods stores. Washington political hostess Mary Clemmer Ames complained, "While her sister women scrape lint, the wife of the President of the United States spent her time rolling to and fro between Washington and New York, intent on extravagant purchases for herself and the White House." The New York Times reported that there were austerity campaigns afoot among the well-heeled. Ladies were boycotting imported fabrics during the duration of the war. A few days later, the Washington papers printed news that a patriotic society of women were organizing Ladies' National Covenant. They pledged reducing the consumption of foreign luxuries, not unlike women of the Revolution, who boycotted tea and formed such associations. But these particular developments seemed in direct rebuke to Mrs. Lincoln's habits. Mary Lincoln was so invested in her own agenda that she demanded and received confirmation from government offices that the United States must not offend European allies by boycotting imports. She therefore justified her taste for foreign goods as patriotic by doing her part to bolster the balance of trade. Once again, she knew these excesses flew in the face of her husband's wishes, but she blundered on. She kept up a steady correspondence with political bosses in New York and D.C. throughout this period and fought her fears that crushing debts would be exposed unless her husband won his bid for re-election. But he won, and with peace, Mary felt she and her husband would at long last enjoy life more, especially if peace, only peace, could be achieved, if Robert could be brought home. And with her husband's death, and on the heels of surrender, we find that Mrs. Lincoln was robbed of this chance of happiness. She became known as eccentric. She was derided. She was notorious. Her bad press during the war was nothing compared to the melodramas she endured as a widow. Most prominent claims by her husband's former partner that Lincoln's sweetheart from New Salem, Anne Rutledge, had been Lincoln's one true love. Equally damaging were claims by Lincoln's business associates that the president's widow was a blackmailing harridan besmirching her husband's memory. In 1867, she tried to pawn her jewelry and wardrobe, and thus the old clothes scandal unfolded. Political enemies suggested that she did not deserve sympathy or financial support. When Lincoln died, there was no widow's pension, and her husband's estate was tied up with lawyers for over 2 years. And it was the lawyers who argued that when Lincoln was assassinated, he was not a soldier, so how could she get a soldier's pension? She was in a state of severe financial dislocation following her husband's death. Once her older son Robert married in 1868, she took her remaining son Tad to Europe for his education. Homesick, the two returned to Robert's home in Chicago in 1871, but shortly thereafter, Tad fell fatally ill, and his death hit his mother and brother very hard. A few years later, Mary Lincoln endured an embittering alienation from her only remaining son, Robert. In 1875, he had her committed to asylum against her will, ostensibly for her own safety, but an act which caused incalculable damage to her esteem. This also created a permanent stain on her reputation. Headlines were filled with recriminations, with ridicule. Was she crazy? Continues the most common query biographers encounter. In the 1920s, while Lincoln biographers gathered momentum, what about Mary Lincoln? There was a group of people who began to examine her. Honoré Wiltse Morrow claimed, Mary Lincoln is one of the most lied about women in the world. So she published a volume, as did Catherine Helm, Mary's niece, in 1928, and these studies took aim at the negative images projected and executed and supported by William Herndon. Certainly for the 19th century, William Herndon proved the most persistent damning critic of Mary Lincoln. The personal antipathy between the two has been well documented. Mary had consented to an interview, but then she retracted and enmity flowed. The hostilities broke out into the open a little more than a year after Herndon began collecting information, and well before he gave his most sensational speech on Lincoln and Anne Rutledge in November of 1866. Ushering in the Rutledge industry was perhaps Herndon's most enduring legacy. For Mrs. Lincoln, this was a full frontal assault, a shattering blow. More balanced, sympathetic accounts of Mary did counter these charges. The aforementioned volumes by Morrow, Helm, were joined by other rehabilitative work, including studies by William Evans, Carl Sandburg in 1932, Ruth Painter Randall in 1953, Justin and Linda Turner in 1972, Ishbel Ross in 1973, and Jean Baker in 1987. However, during the late 20th century, Michael Burlingame rejected this revisionist interpretation and replaced Herndon as Mary Lincoln's harshest critic. Burlingame places the blame for any misery within the marriage, which is a given in his estimation, on Mary. In his thoughtful, important studies of Lincoln, Burlingame frequently introduces Mary Lincoln's shortcoming and alleged disastrous effects on her husband. For example, Burlingame suggests, in order to avoid conflict with his difficult wife, he spent an inordinate amount of time away from home. Such a tactic may have made his unfortunate marriage tolerable, but it deprived the children of much contact with their father. Lincoln's absenteeism may seem striking, but it might have not been only a strategy to get away from Mary, but one to make successful contacts for his law practice and later political career. The absence of context leads to face value conclusions, conclusions which depend on which side of the Janus face the scholar encounters. Burlingame's one-sided perspective is showcased in his essay, The Lincoln's Marriage, a fountain of misery, a quality absolutely infernal, and expanded on in his 2-volume, 2,000-page biography of Lincoln published in 2008. In fairness, Burlingame is framing his argument within the context of previous literature. He directly challenges the work of Jean Baker and Ruth Randall, accusing them of cherry-picking the evidence about Lincoln's relationship, selectively providing quotes to support arguments. I would suggest that this is essentially what all scholars might be accused of, but perhaps some do it more skillfully than others. Burlingame comments, the few surviving letters between the Lincolns do not suggest a deep love on either side, and goes on to state, the most remarkable feature of that correspondence is its sparseness. Burlingame could have added that it's well known that the Lincolns burned much of their personal correspondence before leaving Springfield for the White House. Even more to the point, Robert Todd Lincoln, painfully reticent about family matters, sealing his father's papers until 25 years after his own death, sought out, and we know, collected his mother's letters. Letters between the Lincolns offer rich material for mining, producing layered and multiple interpretations, although Burlingame claims his interpretation is paramount and others are sadly flawed. But in the 21st century, C.A. Tripp, the author of The Intimate World of Abraham Lincoln, has replaced Burlingame as Mary Lincoln's most rabid detractor. As Gene Baker argues, he uses the familiar rants of previous historians and employs selective evidence to eviscerate Mary as someone who literally can do no right. Tripp goes a bit further. He complains that she is psychopathic like Hitler. And I think whenever you bring in the Hitler comparison, you know there is something else perhaps going on. Tripp proclaims that their marriage was one of the worst marital misfortunes in recorded history, and goes on to suggest that Mary was Lincoln's cross to bear. His flair for hyperbole presents as much of a problem as does Tripp's own death before his book was published. Thus, the discussions of Lincoln's private life remain unresolved, controversial, ongoing. Mary Lincoln as her husband's cross to bear, however, is a popular refrain echoing down through the generations of Lincoln scholars. 3 following quotes dealing with Mrs. Lincoln during her White House years will give examples. Richard Carwardine in 2003 called her the grief-stricken wife who demanded more emotional support than she returned. William Davis in 2004 argued, by the time of the Civil War, the passion in the Lincoln marriage had long since faded. His neglect and the demands and tensions created by war do not seem to justify Mary's irrational, hurtful outbursts, her personal extravagance, and on occasion, her selfish behavior. Finally, Daniel Mark Epstein, who has written several books, I would suggest has finally gone over to the dark side of Lincoln studies, and he proclaims, by the time she became First Lady, she was vain, jealous, profligate, given to heroic tantrums. By 1863, when Mary Lincoln was not tormenting her husband, she was neglecting him. Again, I suggest that if Mary Lincoln had also died in 1865, my what if Booth had been a bad shot counterfactual question, if she even had not been hit by assassin's bullet, but if she had died quietly, perhaps in Chicago in the summer of 1865, what would we make of their marriage? Her early demise would have spared her the old clothes scandal. No pension battles with debates on the congressional floor disparaging her. No spiritualist photographs of herself with her husband. No confinement to Bellevue, the private asylum in Batavia, Illinois. Perhaps she would have been showered with posthumous praise for being loyal to her husband during this deeply divided time in our country. Her reputation would fade with her death, but biographers frequently resurrected her only to knock her down. And it is the series of indictments leveled against her that seem to me to suggest an endless loop of character assassination. A 2013 headline in New York Magazine anoints Mrs. Lincoln the First Lady of Debt and suggests a long line of fault and criminality. Echoing contemporary critics, the online essay scolds, arriving at the White House, she overspent her 4-year budget for home repairs and decor in less than 1 year, half of it on fine china and French wallpaper. Her vanity was scored as well. A wardrobe that included a $2,000 dress and 300 pairs of kid gloves. When she couldn't get her hands on her husband's estate, she suggested a pension like hundreds and then thousands of women who petitioned the government across America. Statesmen and foes alike stood up to question her loyalty, her methods, her patterns of behavior, as the money could only be allocated by a special act of Congress. She won her steady income 5 years after she was widowed, but she still died in relative isolation and need. The indictments some historians have leveled against her appear disproportionately harsh. They employ the distorted lens of hindsight. For example, when a scholar laments Mary's shopping spree in the months leading up to Lincoln's assassination, he, and in the most egregious cases it has been a he, is being unfair to his subject as the language betrays. Mary did not have a timeline as to when her husband would die, nor a memo as to the date of his assassination. Unlike Imelda Marcos, with whom she was compared by the American press in the 1980s, Mary Lincoln was not addicted to shoes. However, her serial, multiple glove purchases were nothing short of a mania. Incredible indictments continue that she was scheming, criminal, even diseased. A 2003 volume suggests that Mary Lincoln's ailments at the end of her life stem from the effects of syphilis. There was a harsh 19th century remedy to cure syphilis, but this was not Mary's problem. Instead, as she was in physical decline, it was her back, it was her eyesight, many other attributes began to fail, but equally debilitating was the estrangement from her only remaining son. And the fading memories of happier days, the long, drawn-out deterioration of her physical stamina and mental faculties. Mary Lincoln's character had undergone relentless, repeated assaults, succumbing to what might be viewed as scholarly conspiracies. Lincoln was killed by a bullet and gone within hours. Mrs. Lincoln's suffering stretched another 16 years. She was so miserable that she could not overcome the oceans of grief and floods of sorrow that would periodically engulf her. Many times when she was able to find some light in the darkness and beat back her despair, new obstacles intervened. She embraced the final escape of death and anticipated a reunion with her husband. And that might have been the end of it. If Mary Lincoln could join the company of Sarah Polk and Florence Harding, strong-willed first ladies who fade into obscurity, but because of the meteoric rise of her husband's reputation, Mary Lincoln, like left luggage, was periodically retrieved and unpacked, investigated again and again in the court of public opinion, always judged by the standards of her cross-examiners. On these sliding and even slippery scales, Lincoln's wife has been the one to take abuse. Her character has been proverbially toasted on the coals, and yet she continues to fascinate and foil those who want to consign her to the historical dustbin. I'm always puzzled why so many scholars feel that Lincoln's elevation is almost directly proportionate to his wife's denigration, or why historians praise Lincoln's insight, astute judgment in all matters except that of his marriage. Many of his own words contradict this interpretation and instead suggest that he recognized Mary's central role to his stability and her fostering of his political prosperity. After they moved into the White House, whatever liabilities she presented during the Civil War, Mary Lincoln was the yeast, I think, that allowed him to grow to greatness. And she was a lifelong companion with whom he hoped to pursue his dreams. But I'm not here to propose the Mary Lincoln reset, rather to try and shift some of our sympathy for poor Mary, not because she suffered an undiagnosed mental illness, as many allegedly sympathetic scholars have suggested, that they, as 21st century doctors of history or 21st century sleuths, are able to dig out. Speculation should be responsible. And I suggest the reckless, continuing caricature by assassins should not be silenced, but rather be answered. I attempted to make some sort of restitution with my 2009 biography, which was written on the foundations of previous scholars' work, most notably Ruth Painter Randall and June Baker, to whom I am indebted. But more importantly, I undertook my project within the framework of what I call a hostile work environment, the lead up to the Lincoln bicentennial, when it seemed Mary Lincoln haters were out in full force. We could never truly restore a reputation. Smeared in the headlines, the correction is most often on the inside pages in small type. But it remains valuable to expose the kind of brutal conspiratorial plots that might still be being cooked. Assassinations in American history have complex dynamics which reflect tenacious patterns of folklore storytelling, but in this sesquicentennial season, we should recognize there are layer upon layer of truths. Not all truths will be self-evident, and certainly few will equal to the fictions we continue to tell ourselves, or they won't always land squarely within the parameters of political correctness. But as historians, we should strive toward the awkward intersections where new truths might emerge. The past is always before us, while historians will debate endlessly clashing interpretations. It's my hope that more than a century and a half later, this tragedy of Abraham Lincoln's assassination, we can don new 3D specs to take in the fact that discrediting Lincoln's wife, pummeling her reputation, is a blood sport that has passed its sell date. So in 2015, can we not shift some of the attention onto the private rather than public tragedy of Lincoln's passing? Abraham was gone, and his wife, sons, like thousands of other American families, were bowed down from their loss. Mary lived out the rest of her days struggling with her grief and even beyond death. Her soul might remain restless, but today we can recognize with our battles hell-bent to destroy or equally committed to rebuild, Mary Lincoln may reflect more about our own times than those of Mrs. Lincoln. And as a biographer, let us continue to praise difficult women. So thank you. I know some of you have come from a long distance. I welcome some of my friends coming from distances, and some may have to sneak out now. But if there are any questions, I'm very happy to try to answer them.
So for the question and answer session, if you have a question, please raise your hand and wait for someone to bring you the microphone.
There's a gentleman waving his hand right over there, miss. Oh, we have a question here. Whoever's got the mic.
Thank you for your talk, Catherine, and it's perfectly timed, and the tone was perfect. Thank you. I have a question for you. Isn't Epstein the one who also points out that Mary Todd was on the train that was attacked in Baltimore? Isn't he one of the biographers that recognizes that she had a near close call herself?
Yeah, she had many close calls. The close call that I point out, and it is still somewhat debated, but I think it's safe to say, and it was revealed as such in the movie Lincoln, because Tony Kushner cited with those of us who suggest that it was really a carriage accident, that Mary, Abe said, "I'll ride a horse today," and Mary later was going in his carriage, and this was in 1863, shortly before the draft riots, before the July 4th celebrations, before the battles of Gettysburg and Vicksburg, before I bring up the draft riots, because her carriage accident was so severe that at first it was thought she was all right, then she got an infection, and Robert was on his way to Washington and was caught up in New York, and they were afraid he might not get there in time. She did recover, but Robert later said that he thought his mother was unalterably physically transformed by that particular accident. And I suggest, and I stand by, there was a alteration of the carriage, which was meant to disable the carriage and cause an accident. So it was an attempt on Lincoln's life. And we have to look at the pattern of carriage accidents during that period. Some were very serious, but it was a way in which many people were severely injured. I mean, we know that very night Seward was saved, actually, from an assassin's multiple blows because he had had a carriage accident the week before. So when Lincoln came to tell him his story, of the end of the surrender. He had to stretch out on the bed, and then when the mad pain came in and was stabbing, he had a bandage on, which saved him. So carriage accidents were quite serious, and there was the idea. And Mary was the one who insisted upon protection. They started having guards around her husband. Then, of course, in the conspiracy debates that follow, where was the guard on the night Booth entered the box is a great sort of thing. But Mary was someone who I think very much feared for her husband's safety throughout this period. Thank you, Dr. Giesberg, for your question. There was a gentleman right here, I know, who raised his hand right away. But we're going to go for the
hi,
gentleman
up
in the
here.
back. We'll get to you. I promise we'll get to you.
You mentioned the movie Lincoln, and this is kind of a two-parter. How accurate do you think Sally Field portrayed Mary Lincoln in that movie? And at least from the sense that I got from the movie, a lot of her grief was fueled by the loss of her sons. And I was wondering what you would think if maybe, and this is purely speculative, but had Mary Lincoln not lost her sons at such a young age, and had they lived as long as Robert did, do you think that we would still have this much of a smear campaign on her, or because she was greatly
I
affected?
take your point. I take your point about what do we think that she would have been spared, that her grief, her overwhelming grief, which might have made her unbalanced and going into mourning a year in the White House. But let me back up to your first question about accuracy. Well, this is something which I know, Matt Pinsker and I were just discussing today, the role of movies and films. And I'm a big fan of films, and I'm a big fan of Lincoln. I was an advisor on it. I got to meet with Sally Field. She read my book. She very kindly referred to it as her Bible. So I was very thrilled by that. I also have to say, as a scholar, I'm able to see her say words that I perhaps would not think that Mary would have said. As a scholar, I can take that. As a person, I can take that and make that argument. But I look for authenticity in a film, and I believe she inhabited that role, made it her own, and made us, the viewer, believe through artistic creation that she was Mary Lincoln, that we were seeing Mary Lincoln and Abraham Lincoln have an intimate fight, discussion, debate. So I was quite impressed with that performance. I did not, unlike some of my colleagues, I was a consultant, and I say that my payment was the photo op that I got and an autograph for my younger son, encouraging him to study history, which he did do. And so, for me, it was like an experience. I had had some experience with films before the Lincoln film. I've done work on documentaries, but I'd done some other work on features, and it didn't always turn out so well, because often people in Hollywood would say, could it have happened? And you say, well, it could have happened, but nothing like it ever did happen. Yes, but it could have happened, you see. So they're fiddling around. So I look for a film which tries to come close to approximating the underlying truths which come through storytelling, which come through much research and study. And people are going to disagree about how true a film it was, if it reflected the whole story. No film does. It's an artistic creation. But I do think that it certainly portrayed her grief very well. But we have to remember that there were thousands of women across the country. But Willie's death in February of 1862, represented, I think, his father's hopes. He was such a fond child. He was often featured. Willie and Dad were so mischievous. They often liked to wave Confederate flags from behind their father in the grandstands or up on the roof of the White House. And so they played with pistols. They were nightmares for any mother to have to deal with. And yet, when Willie was gone, it produced such a grief in the White House that no one thought that Mrs. Lincoln would recover. Even Mr. Lincoln threatened her with St. Elizabeth's Hospital across the river, which was an asylum, which fueled much of the later speculation about her mental instability. But I like to see a balanced portrait, so I thought the film showed a balanced portrait. But of course, I'm prejudiced because some of the people connected with the film, the screenwriter, the actors, the director, requested my book, and that was something I was very pleased for, because take all the people who read my book, multiply it by 1,000, and you won't get a percentage of people who see a film. So some of us are trying to have an influence on a future generation interested in history, reading more books, and so my goal is that everyone might leave the movie and go read a book, be it on Kindle, be it in a bookstore, going to your wonderful bookstore here, coming to a talk, and buying a book. So does that answer your question, I hope, in a way?
Thank you. Welcome to Central Pennsylvania, Professor Clinton.
Thank you.
I am a resident of Harrisburg, and in our city cemetery, there is the grave of Mary Lincoln's grandfather. And I was wondering if you had any knowledge as to how he came to be buried in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania?
No, I'm afraid I don't. I think there are probably people in this audience who know better than me how that came about. I do know that that it's interesting because Verena Davis had northern relatives that we don't know that much about. We're just starting to discover. And Mrs. Lincoln, of course, had so many southern relatives. But at the time when they were first becoming governors and admirals, and they were all Americans. And she, therefore, came from a long line of diplomats and a long line of decorated war heroes and slaveholders as well. And she, I think, had a sense of being part of a house divided, that certainly her own home was divided by a mother and a stepmother, two families, and then the siding of most of her siblings with the Confederacy was a divide for her. But I don't think during the war she ever took the position that she was from Yankee stock and proud, because it was the pledge, I think, of the Lincolns that they were Americans. They were all Americans. They lived not at the same time in Kentucky because he was born years later, but they both were born a few miles from one another. And when you go to Pigeon Creek or Sinking Hole, Kentucky, and then you go to Lexington and see the preserved home of Mary Lincoln, you see that they inhabited very much different worlds, but they were a marriage and a couple, and I think an ethic that we will all be Americans and we will remain restored. So I'm so glad to know next time I come, maybe I'll have to make a cemetery visit. Thank you. It's not a Todd, though, correct? It's not a. Is it a Todd? Someone was talking to me about this earlier. Right. Well, I'm always pleased to look in on the Todds because people often refer to Lincoln's wife as Mary Todd Lincoln with a sort of, very, and it plays into the fact that we know that her husband frequently said that God only needed one D and the Todds needed two. So he was very much playing on her aristocratic background, and so we understand that. But in her own lifetime, there is no signature after her marriage where Todd appears. It was not her middle name. But I found that Dolly Todd Madison and Mary Todd Lincoln entered the American popular imagination in the early part of the 20th century when descendants of the Todd clan decided to promote this. They gave a portrait to the White House, and it was for Mary Todd Lincoln, in a way inserting the Todd into her legacy. So I sort of have a section in my book where I say she didn't even get to have her own name. She is renamed. And when I would say to people, I'm writing a biography of Mary Lincoln, they would say, who? And I'd have to say Mary Todd Lincoln, because she's somehow been recast in this way as a product of her genteel ancestors. But she gave those up when she remained pledged to her own husband. And by the way, her correspondence going in and out of the White House was read and censored because there was the feeling that she might betray secrets. But I think also because, one too many effigies and hangings, and she was sent a rope for Lincoln to be strung up. And so she was a very high-strung woman and didn't like the images of her husband's lynching being brought into the White House. So.
Do you think that Lincoln would have been killed if he went to the formal ceremony of the American flag being raised at Fort Sumter?
That's a good question. Do I think that there would have been people who might have assassinated Lincoln in South Carolina?
Do you think you would have been better off going there instead of going to Force Theater?
Well, I don't think it was an either. I don't think it was an either or. I don't. But I am trying to say I will play a little game, which when you get to college they're very fond of, called Devil's Advocate. And that is you kind of play it out. You see, because I am very, I'm very tortured by this because there are many, many questions. And I actually wrote a book about Booth, which some suggested might be sympathetic. But I wrote it under a pseudonym, by the way. It's a graphic novel, which most of my historical colleagues thought that I had taken to writing porn when I told them I'd written a graphic novel, because I started this very early in the century. But my point being, I think that we have to remember that there were insurgents throughout the Confederacy who did not believe that the surrender, that Lee giving up, meant that the war was over. And we have to remember that John Wilkes Booth, who had been prepared to kidnap and hold Lincoln ransom, felt that this act would reignite the war. I think in a place like South Carolina, there was also a resenting spark still there, and it might have flared up, and it might have been injustice by the gun, which was indeed, you see, because if Lincoln had been killed a week earlier, he would have been the commander-in-chief being murdered during war. Yes, it would have been an assassination. Would it have been a part of the war? You know, we can play these kind of counterfactual games about, it's not a game, but we do sort of look at strategies and see. I think the strategy, you have to remember, was to keep the war going. And there were Confederate troops and Confederate armies and ships and people who were clinging to the notion of a Confederate victory could be wrought even after the surrender by Lee. So I don't think it was fated that Lincoln would be killed, but I do think that Booth played a very dramatic, significant role in this, and I have my own ideas about how and why. But I can recommend a book for you called Fortune's Fool by a wonderful scholar named Terry Alford, who's been working for 20 years on a book on Booth and tells us a lot of new things about Booth and insight into what his psyche was. South Carolina in 2001 was having a battle over the rebuilding of the Fort Sumter National Park Service site, that people in South Carolina were objecting to some of the things being put in there. I was a visiting professor at the Citadel, and I remember listening to someone on the radio saying, "Why are they putting up a Union flag?" And of course, it was the flag of the United States of America. It was a National Park Service for the United States of America, and we have to realize that people continued to harbor these feelings down into the 21st century, where they're talking about, resisting the notion that we are all one country, we're coming back together. And South Carolina seemed to have a particular talent for that. And they were the first to secede, but I now live in the state of Texas, which is always raising interesting political issues as well, so.
You mentioned the Clintons. And I feel like they've had a lot of kind of attacks on their relationship based that it's more business than personal, which I think was reflected in what the Lincolns' relationship was, like some of the criticisms that they received. Do you think that our age and our society handles kind of strong, independent women as better than the Victorian age that the Lincolns lived in?
No. The Lincolns didn't have Twitter. The Lincolns didn't have Facebook. And they didn't have certain news channels. So I will just say that, the scrutiny is so amazing. But when I was talking to the Washington Post reporter, she was so surprised to learn that newspaper editors tried to pay people and sneak them in, not as spies for the purposes of going across the Confederate Union divide, but just getting dirt. So the idea of having paid informants and sneaking people into the White House was something that Mrs. Lincoln had to contend with in the 1860s. The 24/7 news cycle that we have today. But I will say that when you go back and look at the 1860s, and there's some really good books on Washington during this period, I am so struck by the way in which political debates can echo. When people are making arguments about congressional courtesies and civic engagement or lack of it, I can refer them to Freedom's Cap, a book by Guy Gugliotta, which tracks the kind of debates in the 1850s. There are newer ones that do this, but it's very hard. I think I'm really, really struck, however, by the tone and quality of the attacks upon Mrs. Lincoln, that in her own time, she was a woman who was much better educated than her husband. She had 12 years education. We also know she was a teacher. She did try to participate in diplomacy. She tried to participate in appointments. As I said, she held fierce grudges. In the film, you ask about this accuracy question. In the film, Lincoln, they show her with a little notebook counting up toting numbers for the 13th Amendment. That's not accurate, but it's very authentic because she did do that in Lincoln's Senate campaign, which he lost, and she kept a tote, and so when it came time to appoint cabinet members, she vetoed people who didn't vote right. She kept her grudges. She didn't speak to a woman who was in her bridal party because her husband, she felt, stole away Lincoln's chance at being a senator. So she was very political in her own day, and that made her very dangerous to many people. But I think we're now not in danger unless we see that we need to, in the 21st century, use the talents of all of our citizens, men and women, those new to America, those whose ancestors have been here a long time. We need to use all Americans to make our country stronger, and that's my hope for the 21st century.
So I knew that you mentioned during the lecture that as you were writing one of your works on Mary Lincoln back in 2009, I think, how you sort of felt like you were maybe going against the negative tide of Mary Lincoln that might be developing around the 150th anniversary of a lot of Civil War events.
Right.
Now,
well, it's a wall of literature is there,
yeah,
and it has this view of Mary, let's say. And I thought of it like like you're trying to do a fair and balanced treatment. Let's use that language. And if the language is, if your treatment is right here, you can't just say, I'm going to write a book and ignore this. You're trying to, in some ways, counter negative stereotypes, which have been established as truth by a body of scholarship. That's where I was in 2005, 6, writing.
But my question is, was that tide against Mary Lincoln on the 150th anniversary of various events as strong as you thought it might have been?
Well, it was on the anniversary of Lincoln's birthday. It was the bicentennial of Lincoln's birth. And what I just couldn't understand was why no one was trying to look at the situation, I thought, through Lincoln's eyes. We often talk about being biography, and we try and get inside a person's head. My philosophy is you don't, psychoanalyze by going inside the head. Instead, you try and climb in and see the world through their eyes and present the world the way they did. And when I went inside Lincoln's worldview, I frequently saw very positive aspects of Mary, and I couldn't see how or why my colleagues were, I thought, creating a portrait that I didn't recognize. So my idea was to try and, start, you can't start with a clean canvas. You have to some way make explanation. I would explain why I thought Mary Lincoln bought so many gloves in March of 1865. It didn't seem like a big deal to me, but it seemed to bother some of my colleagues. So I would answer that very specifically, which could make me look like a Mary Lincoln defender, like a Mary Lincoln, advocating. I found her a very difficult person to work on. She did have many, many flaws. it's difficult to bring out the flaws when there are so many flaws being emphasized to try and do a fair and balanced portrait. However, it was very easy for me to try and attack those flaws that I thought were based upon the assumption that women were inferior. And those flaws, I think, are very, very strong in a body of 19th century historical literature and interpretation, that they're weak or uneducated or many other kinds of things that I thought we needed to look in wartime Washington and see that there were women advocating, strategizing, using gossip politically, using the newspapers in ways that advanced different causes, personal, political, and that was going on in Washington in 1860, and it's going on in Washington, I think, in 2015, if I'm not wrong.
Oh, yeah.
So.
Commitment to asylum notwithstanding, what role did Robert play in this assassination of his mother? Was he ever her defender, or was he always silently or openly condemning her like so many did?
I'll answer your question if you tell me what the H stands for. Okay. Well, you know, Robert was a Harvard man. And as a Harvard man, he had a very strong sense of propriety. His biographer refers to him as a Victorian gentleman. And there is a great debate over Robert's role and relationship with his mother. I think that, for example, to go back to the film, there was a strained relationship between Lincoln and his oldest son, Robert. And I think that's brought out very powerfully in the film. I think it's brought out in the secondary literature that he had allegedly a lot of Todd in him. There also is the idea that Robert and his mother had similar kinds of personality traits. Not that they were similar, they had personality traits. So we see that Mary always tried to be very directive with her older son. And now she's at a point of great vulnerability. And he, of course, is trying to launch his career. He has this situation where, I know this is going to be strange to anyone in here, but that Mary Lincoln was not the easiest mother-in-law. And and Robert's wife did not particularly get along with Mary. Actually, at the beginning, it was a love affair where Mary Lincoln said she picked out Mary Harlan, and then eventually it turned quite hostile. So we look and see how this evolved. We see that Robert was trying to balance many things, including the fact that he had a kind of board of advisors, his father's old cronies, especially in Chicago, that saw him as a new light in the Republican Party and someone they could put forward as a candidate, but not with his crazy mother kiting around the country. And it wasn't just that they thought of her as perhaps, quote, crazy, but also there was a problem in that there were Mary impersonators, people going to hotels, running up bills. So you would see things where it's like, this woman is not... is purporting to be Mrs. Lincoln and isn't. So Mary was very much a problem for her son, but also a problem to him that he could not have her in his home. He asked his aunt Elizabeth to take her in, but we now have evidence from Jason Emerson's recovery of Mary Lincoln's lost letters. These were letters that were written to her lawyer, who she obtained to try and get her out of the asylum. And the lawyer was hung on to this correspondence. It was supposed to be destroyed, and it turned up that Jason Emerson found copies of these letters. So we now can look at what the relationship was. We know that Robert was trying to get his aunt to take Mary in because she'd been like a mother, an older sister. She was not available. And so he was made to feel if he did not confine his mother to an asylum, she might actually do harm to herself. And that was the rationale for his going through the courtroom proceeding and having her legal rights taken away. Now, we will continue, I think, to agree, disagree, debate, depending upon the kind of cycles of evidence we continue to dig up. But I do think it's safe to say that she was very disturbed on the 10th anniversary of her husband's death, which fell shortly before this episode where she came quite manic to Chicago. He felt it necessary to have her put in front of a courtroom, and the courtroom revoked her rights, and she was confined to an asylum. Within 4 months, she, however, moved to her sister's place. At the end of the year, her rights were restored. So we could see a period of reconciliation with her son. She wrote him one of the most blistering attacks and was quite alienated from him. And we scholars continue to debate whether they ever were able to be reconciled. Robert had a daughter named Mary, and her grandmother became quite affectionate about her, and he brought her to visit. And I do think in some ways we can look at the way in which Robert used his own child to find his way back to his mother. But there is great disagreement over what his motives were for the incarceration. I can say whatever the motives were, it was a brutal, humiliating, damaging experience for Mary Lincoln, and one that I don't think she was down. She tried to get up, and I don't think she ever really recovered her momentum after the episode in the asylum.
It seems as though Herndon started off the negative view of Mary Lincoln, and a lot of other people kind of followed his lead. So why did William Herndon and Mary Lincoln dislike each other so much?
Well, some people would think he wasn't very likable. Other people will think she wasn't very likable. And I found it interesting that when you get to the Herndon question, it does seem to be, I haven't found that many people. I have found some people that have found Herndon's evidence more believable. They've changed their attitude towards his evidence. But he just went out there asking questions, and I think that he, of course, after Lincoln's death, could play a very dramatic role in Lincoln's legacy. And I think that he inserted himself in a way that is quite interesting. I mean, I found it very interesting. He was his law partner. He lived in the same town. They were there for years. There is no record of William Herndon ever having dinner at the Lincoln home, for example. So I think it was a social issue in some ways, but also he allegedly was very fond of alcohol, and I think Mary deeply resented him. And then after he began to investigate her husband's life and interview people, go to New Salem, that was going to be the end of it. But I think Herndon was someone who tried to play a larger-than-life role in Lincoln's legacy, and for many years it was knocked back. And then I would say, wouldn't you, Matt, that he's had a really interesting historical reputation, that in the 21st century, I would say Herndon is a much more powerful figure in Lincoln studies, much more relied upon by the scholarship than he was, for example, in the late 20th century. Would you agree with that? I'm just asking if, he has.
I think you're right. I don't find it very credible, but I think you're right.
Well, that's just because you're so naturally bright and thoughtful. And
on that note, we should thank Captain Clark. That there is a book signing to follow, so I'm going to ask Catherine to come outside. If you want to ask her an additional question or talk to her, she'll be in the lobby, but thank you again for coming, and
thank you, Dickinson College, for being such a wonderful host.